Hi Claudius, how are you?
Hi, Jack. Thanks very much for inviting me. I'm still quite well.
Who are you? What do you do? Tell me a bit about your work.
Wow, okay, who am I? Well, I'm Claudius. I'm currently an assistant professor of Pluralist Economics at the Europa University of Flensburg, and I'm also affiliated with the Institute for the Comprehensive Analysis of the Economy in Austria, Linz, where I've been working before coming to Flensburg. As an academic, I'm doing research on pluralist economics from a pluralist economics perspective. As a person, I think I'm very much influenced from my time I spent in Mexico and Latin America before actually starting to study, where I've been working in a couple of social projects. I think this sparked my interest in these issues of global inequality, economic development, the economy and the society, etc., etc. And then I studied a program where I did economics, social science, and law. And from this, like stepwise, I tried to learn a little bit more about these issues. And yeah, through these various positions, I finally came up at Flensburg, where I now have the feeling I'm now a little bit more settled, and yeah, pretty happy to
Thank you.
be here actually.
Yeah, you talked about your interest there in inequality and some of these global issues, and I'm very interested in your approach to tackling some of these issues, and in terms of pluralist economics and some of these schools of economics that people may not have heard of. So maybe first off, could you say what is pluralist economics, and how should we think about it?
I mean, it's a very simple but also very intricate question. So I think first of all, it's very maybe it's a good idea of starting to define these things because the many people might have heard about pluralism in economics. They heard something about the debate. The debate is usually very fierce. People have very strong opinions about it. So I think it's important to make clear what I personally mean by it, but that doesn't mean that all people share my view. But I mean, for me, what pluralism means in the first place is that pluralism as such is actually a normative stance with regard to adequate levels of diversity of some sort, or plurality, as philosophers would say. And these levels of plurality can refer to various things. When it comes to economics, we could say in the economic discipline as such, there's a certain plurality of, say, different models that people employ. There's a plurality of different topics that are studied by the economics disciplines. There's a certain plurality of epistemological approaches, meaning approaches that tell us how we can learn something about the real world. And there are different levels of plurality about that. And one way of doing pluralist economics is actually to take more a sociological point of view and to study what levels of plurality are actually currently there in the economics discipline, in a more descriptive sense. But when people talk about pluralism in economics, it becomes more normative in the sense that pluralism refers to a debate about the adequate levels of plurality. And that can mean, for example, that we say, okay, we have these results that, for example, research programs or paradigms in economics have this and that level of plurality, but from an epistemological perspective, so from the perspective of scientists who want to learn about the real world, economics as a science would work better if we had more. Or you could also say economics would work better if we had less. So we need to concentrate more on fewer approaches. And I think the intricate thing about pluralism is on the one hand, you have these different dimensions of plurality, like models, theories, people, whatever. And on the other hand, you have these different reasons for why you might argue for bigger or higher or lower levels of plurality. And some people take a very technocratic approach and they say, for example, the goal is to say maximize the knowledge that a scientific community creates about the real world. So we should choose these levels based on how well they are suited to help us as a community to learn about the real world. Others take maybe a more political approach or a more ethical approach, such that they say we have something like the freedom of research. And to make this effective, we need to build institutions that allow people to pursue different methods. And all this is basically part of this debate about pluralism in economics. And I think this is also why pluralism in economics can, on the one hand, be an academic approach, where people try to employ tools from different paradigms, use different models, evaluate how that helps them to learn about reality. But pluralism in economics can also be an activist movement, where people actually try to change the scientific institutions, also from the political sphere, to make feasible the levels of plurality they actually advocate. And we see that. So there are many, especially from the student side, there are a lot of movements that don't consider themselves to be, scientific researchers, but these are more activist movements that advocate certain levels of plurality in economics as a science. So it's a little bit a tough answer, probably long answer, also because pluralism in economics can mean you do philosophical work, sociological work, or applied economic work. I think it's important to have that in mind. And if you engage with somebody about the debate of pluralism, it's always good to make clear, okay, what are we actually talking about in the first place, to avoid these kind of unconstructive debates.
That's helpful. And the way I kind of understand it is, with any science, but say economics, there are many ways you can do it. There are many different kinds of models. It could be more mathematical. It could not be. It could be more empirical. It could not be. But to think about it correctly, like, could you say like what are some of the different approaches that we might think, and how could we characterize the world of economics today, and what it's focused on, right? Because as you say, pluralism is something which goes, actually, maybe we need more of it. So what is the dominant kind of school and approach of economics today? And what would be examples of bringing in more diversity and more plurality of economic thought?
Yeah, so I think probably the most straightforward way to start is to have a look at what economics is today, because I think this then facilitates the understanding of what many pluralists actually want, or why they are dealing with it. And first of all, you are obviously correct. I mean, economics is a social science, so there are in principle there is not the one correct way of doing economics. So one approach to or one way to approach your question is to see, okay, how does the majority of economists approach economic questions? And to this extent, you could look at the journals, you could look at the most prestigious journals in particular, and look at the papers. Are there similarities between them? Do people share a common approach? Another complementary approach would be to look at textbooks that are used in economics education. So what's written in these textbooks? Because this seems to be somehow relevant, considered relevant by the profession as a whole. And here we have actually already two peculiarities of economics as a discipline that distinguishes it from especially other social science disciplines, but also other natural sciences. So the thing is that, first of all, economics is a very textbook-based discipline. So there is a rather small subset of different textbooks that are used in economics education, basically all over the world. And of course, for us who want to understand what's the dominant approach, that's a good thing, because we look at these textbooks and we understand more what it is. And that's much more difficult if you look at, for example, at sociology. Also, economics is a very hierarchical discipline in the sense that journal rankings play a high role in the distribution of academic prestige and the way economists are judged by their peers. So we have very clear rankings of academic outlets, of academic journals. We even have something called the top 5. These are 5 academic journals that are considered to be particularly prestigious and particularly important for making your economics career. And that's also, in some sense, it's good for us, because we can look at these journals and see whether there's something common to them. And if you would ask me, okay, what's this dominant approach, or this main approach in economics? It is an approach that considers itself very much in a positive way of science, of doing science. So people try to delineate hypotheses based on certain kind of mathematical models, and then test these hypotheses using statistical tools. Usually these tools are of a quantitative nature, and these models people use to delineate these hypotheses are also particular models. They are mathematical, they are formal. They are usually so-called maximization come equilibrium models, meaning that these models are written in the rational choice theory. We have actors which we assume to be rational individuals that maximize their utility. And these models are solved by imposing an equilibrium assumption, thereby closing the model and thereby delineating from the rationality and equilibrium assumptions certain implications. And then testing these implications empirically, or using these models to make empirical predictions about the real world. And while there are nuances, of course, I would say that this approach, like a positivist view of science, focus on formal models featuring utility maximizing agents and economic equilibrium. And the idea of testing the hypothesis using quantitative statistical approaches, this is what really makes up I would call the economic mainstream. This is what students learn when they study economics, and this is what you usually do when you want to become a successful economist, and that accounts for a large part, but not the whole part of the discipline. There are also more, say, nuanced properties of that, but I think it's a good way to start.
Picking up on something there, so on the one hand, it's kind of the institution of economics. Like, there are these top 5 journals, there are ways that people publish, but then also there's a kind of specific approach. What are people doing? Well, they're using data, they're making these mathematical models. This might be a big question, but what would be some of the problems of both of those aspects of the way economics is currently being done?
Yeah, so I mean, I need to be fully transparent here. So I'm somebody who I'm not condemning this approach to economics at all, but I'm critical of the sole focus on this way of doing economics, and I think that is problematic. First of all, one needs to think, okay, what could you do differently in principle? And there obviously there are some immediate suggestions, like, for example, that we use also different models, like models that do not use the assumption of utility maximizing agents at the core. Models that do not rely on the assumption of economic equilibrium, because using these different kinds of models makes us see different things in the world. It might even lead to different evaluations of certain hypotheses than the standard approach. And I think there are a couple of examples for where there aren't very good reasons of rejecting these alternative approaches. Like, for example, in macroeconomics, agent-based models. These are models that are not built on utility maximizing individuals, but on individuals that are computationally defined, that use certain heuristics, and you derive the also non-equilibrium dynamics of their interaction using computational simulations. So it's an alternative way of doing macroeconomics. I would say there are very good reasons of doing it in many instances. But it's not being done in the top economics journals. And the reason for why it is not being done is that if you submit these kind of papers to these journals, you usually get rejections such that, hey, it's actually, I mean, if they are friendly, they say, hey, it's an interesting paper, really good work that you're doing, but it's not economics. There's no maximization, there's no equilibrium. That's not what we do. That's not what our audience is interested in. Submit it to a different journal. Or if they are less friendly, they say, hey, it's not rigorous enough because you don't have the analytical clarity of an equilibrium in there. And therefore, people either stop doing this kind of modeling if they really want to stay in economics, and they switch to the standard way, or they are going to different outlets or to different disciplines and publish their work there. And this reproduces, of course, the focus within economics. Also because those people who are then later teaching economics students are those who have been successful in getting into the top journals and into the top prestigious institutions. And they obviously teach what they have learned before, what they consider to be valuable, what they consider to be good economics. So they are not teaching agent-based models to their pupils, but the standard approach. And this is how it reproduces. And then again, you could also say that, okay, maybe economics would benefit also from more qualitative approaches or less model-based science in some sense. That's not a claim that only comes from very, let's say, non or alternative economists like myself, but there has been a paper, I think, 2 or 3 years ago by George Akerlof, who has won the Nobel Prize for this kind of standard model he delineated. And he speaks of sins of omissions in economics, where you say, hey, okay, the economics approach is great, but there are certain questions for which it is poorly suited, for which we need, for example, more qualitative research, or where we need research that is hard to evaluate in a quantitative fashion, or that doesn't fit the equilibrium-based approaches. And especially young scholars, they don't see any prospect with this kind of research because they can't publish it in the top economics journals. So either they don't do it or they move elsewhere. And this leaves the discipline of economics with certain blind spots. And that's a bad thing. And this is what many pluralists in economics say. There are certain blind spots in the discipline. That's not because the individuals are stupid or because they don't want to look at it, but because the institutions of economics provide incentives that actually suggest scientific scholars to not pursue these kind of questions or not to develop skills in these kind of models and tools, and therefore it reproduces the kind of focus in economics to a particular approach. And to discuss why this is problematic and what one could do about, this is one topic of pluralist economics. So,
as you discussed there, some of the problems of economics, and then suggest things about pluralist economics, like for example, having more computational agent-based models rather than say the mathematical ones that we have at the moment, but then also having some qualitative models. It's very interesting that it really is the blind spots. It's not saying we should do one other thing. It's like, let's incorporate many different things in, and the economic approach that we have at the moment can be really useful, but it might benefit from these other areas. Would you be able to talk a bit about this agent-based modeling? And what is it? How does it differ from the current approach? Am I right in saying it's more computational, and what exactly would be involved in that?
So as I said, like agent-based modeling it's just one example, and I'm not the person who says, okay, all economists should do agent-based modeling all the time.
Okay.
It comes with its own pros and cons. I'm just saying it should have a viable place in the economics toolkit, and it currently doesn't have. So the idea is if you have a particular question that you want to answer, and you decided for some reason to use an agent-based model, then what you do is you start thinking about, okay, who are the relevant actors in this system? So maybe take as an example, you want to develop, or you want to understand the relationship between economic growth, economic well-being, and ecological damages by, say, the UK economy. You want to understand it, and to do that, you want to build a model, and you're building an agent-based model. So you need to think about who are the adequate actor or the relevant actors in this system, and you might come for theoretical reasons to the conclusion, okay, we need some households, I don't know, we need a central bank, we need firms, and that's it for some reasons. Then you need to build basically a formal model that specifies the rules of behavior that these different actors do with regard to their relevant actions. And in contrast to the standard approach in economics, you are not assuming that these actors are maximizing some kind of utility function, but you are thinking about certain kind of heuristics that these actors use. So, for example, you say, okay, as a household, you are selling your labor until a certain threshold, and from the incomes that you get, you spend a certain fraction for your on your savings, and you spend a certain fraction on consumption. You might even create some rules of thumb about how you think that the economy in the future develops, and thereby adjusting the shares of savings and consumptions. But you do that from a so-called locally constructive way, in the sense that you look at the agent as an autonomous thing that has its way of thinking, that's his or her rules of thumb that it employs to do its decisions. Same for the firms. You think about some strategies they use to estimate the market share, some rules of thumbs, how many people they hire, how many things they produce, how much savings they want to have, etc., etc. And you do that for all the agents without assuming an equilibrium or anything. But you're doing these kind of heuristics, and you do that in a computer. Then you translate it into computer code. Doesn't matter what kind of language. And then you simulate the whole population, and you see how these agents interact with each other and what the implications are. Then usually you find out that the whole thing doesn't work, and you try fixing things, and you make new assumptions. You need to add parameters, like, for example, typical saving shares, etc., etc. Then you look at empirical data to inform these kind of decisions. And then you simulate the model again, and you check. Maybe you use also a more sophisticated way to see whether that the results of the model are plausible, right? That, for example, the distribution of firm size somehow fits to what we see in reality. That the income distribution in the household somehow fits what we currently observe, and thereby you try to make the model more empirically coherent. And maybe the outcome of your model is some kind of equilibrium. That you see, okay, there is some kind of equilibrium growth path for the UK economy, and there is some kind of equilibrium growth paths for the ecological damages that are associated with certain kinds of economic growth in this economy. And in this case, then the result might not be that different to a standard economic approach, where you assume that there is an equilibrium from the beginning, and where you assume that agents maximize their utility, and where these two things are your anchors in keeping your model tractable. In agent-based models, the challenge is actually not to have these kind of anchors of the assumed equilibrium and utility maximization. So you need to look a little bit more at empirical data to somehow keep your model tractable. That's also a potential drawback. At the same time, you really get an information about whether it's viable to assume economic equilibrium or not, or whether actually the feature of the economy is more that of a complex system where we have a lot of non-equilibrium dynamics taking place in the system, where it's the inability of people to maximize their utility that is important to understand how they react, for example, to ecological shocks, because they are not able to anticipate them and they are messing with their heuristics, so to speak. So it can produce different insights. But as you already probably recognize when I'm talking about it, in some sense, agent-based models can be more fuzzy because you have less strict rules on how to design them. By the way, there are also fewer norms of how to design an agent-based model as compared to these standard models. At the same time, they can produce patterns and they can endogenously produce dynamics that many of the mainstream models cannot. So there's pros and cons involved in this process. But of course, you see different things, like, for example, the messing up with the heuristics. This is something that you can only see in the model where you have heuristics. So the vantage point is different. Can't tackle the same question, but with a very different mindset also. And that makes you see different things.
It's interesting that you can kind of find out new equilibrium and kind of see what happens as like the system evolves. But as you say, you point out the challenges too, because, for example, you can, as I tried to make some computational model, and you realize agents don't they do something ridiculous, and like this is not going to work, and then you go, wait, how? Then you're messing with what the agents do in the heuristics, and then you're like, well, I'm doing and I'm imposing, is that correct? And you have to sort of then say why you implemented those assumptions, right? So there's pros and cons there.
It really forces you to justify these choices that you make. I think one potential advantage of agent-based models is that you don't have these conventions you can refer to. So you really need to design the model and justify the model by reference to empirical data. But yeah, sometimes it simply doesn't work. But still, I don't want to give you the impression that the construction of these agent-based models is arbitrary. Also, so actually the community is developing more and more tools of how you can also formalize the way of how to choose parameter values, of how you can use tools, for example, from machine learning to maximize the probability that the outcome of the model is sensible according to some viable standards, etc., etc. But the approach is different. That's what I'm saying. You're not starting with these optimization equilibrium assumptions. You're starting with viability assumptions about the heuristics and the kind of interaction structures, and then you see what comes out of it.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It's a different approach in this sense.
You mentioned that ecological economics and how one specific thing that you might try and help find out is actually where does an equilibrium converge, and you say that maybe the British economy goes towards an equilibrium that does this or that bad thing or this and that good thing. So would you be able to speak a bit about ecological environmental economics and how these kinds of approaches might help us learn about them?
I mean, on the one hand, it's pretty clear that both the mainstream models and the agent-based model, and I'm just talking about these two for the reasons of simplicity. But both approaches can in principle be very informative in the debate about ecological sustainability, because it is very clear that we as a society need to make choices about what kind of economic activities we want to boost, about which kind of economic activities need to be substituted in the future for achieving the goal that our societies can actually reproduce themselves, that we can meet the socioeconomic needs of the populations, while at the same time taking planetary boundaries seriously. And in principle, any or models that take into account the economy and the environment are greatly needed. Yet, what I think makes the whole thing quite difficult in some sense is that obviously the choice of your modeling framework to some extent determines how you look at this process. And I think one very nice, maybe also a little bit polemic illustration are the debates about the models of William Nordhaus, he won the Nobel Prize in Economics for developing models that take into account economic models that take into account the environment. And the models that are built on his suggestions and in his tradition, they have been used quite widely. It's this particular kind of so-called integrated assessment models. They are built on these assumptions about economic equilibrium, utility maximization, and so on. And he uses these models to evaluate particular policies for saving emissions. And in the economic models, there are the assumptions of utility maximization allows you, if you accept certain kind of utilitaristic assumptions, allow you to make welfare analysis and to make claims about what kind of policies are societally beneficial or not. And these models, when you use them, when you apply them, you come to results for optimal policies. And these optimal policies are associated with certain kind of ecological damages, therefore certain kinds of global warming. And according to Nordhaus and his models, he famously claimed that the optimal policies, or those policies are optimal that lead to a global warming of 3.5%. And this is obviously very much at odds with what many climate scientists say. They say, okay, it should be, maybe it should be 1.5, 2, or whatever, but definitely significantly lower than 3.5, and 3.5 would actually be devastating to many people in the world. If you take an agent-based model, or there are a couple of agent-based models which are pretty well suited to take into account nonlinearities, for example. So that's because they don't assume equilibrium, but these kind of heuristics, and therefore things like tipping points that we know are relevant in ecological systems. So points where the behavior of the system changes dramatically as compared to before. This is easier to implement in agent-based models, and it's also easier to implement in agent-based models the heterogeneous impacts of the damages on different actors in the population, simply because of the computational way these models are constructed. And many agent-based models come to quite different conclusions also from a welfare point of view. So where they would suggest different set of policies with different implications. And then we as scientists, we are obviously a little bit in a problem, because we see that the methods we choose have a huge impact on what comes out of it in the end. I think this is a debate that we as scientists need to be serious about. And in the best case, I would say these different alternatives are out there, and we evaluate them according to shared quality standards and about also based on our conversations with other disciplines. But for this to happen, both of these models need to have their place in the scientific community. And I guess this is here where I'm critical of the current state of economics, where we have this dominant view on a particular way of models, which has been criticized very harshly also from other disciplines. People who are obviously also knowledgeable about these areas, but where the economics disciplines doesn't have to offer that many of the alternatives that would be needed. Simply because of the institutions according to which incentives are provided to economists. And this is therefore, I think, a nice example where this lack of model plurality in economics causes some epistemological damages, and where in the longer term it also comes with really severe societal costs, because societal changes are built upon these models, and these decisions could have been better if we had a larger plurality of different models in economics.
I think it's also interesting there to think about how, like, what comes to mind to me is it's so complicated, right? That that you can take these multiple approaches, right? But you're still gonna have to think about are we need to make sure that we don't just make our models in accordance with like the level of warming that we think from some other area that we like, and I mean, one thing is to kind of broach how we can integrate different areas of economics together. How sort of institutionally and in a meta sense can we choose values so that we can all agree, like, even if we have different approaches, how can we bring them together? What could you say about value in economics and the value judgments that we bring?
This is a super difficult debate, and I would say it's not. It's a debate that's particularly severe in economics, and it's very illustrative to have it on economics because economics has such a big societal impact. But this is where it's a debate that you usually have in the context of pluralist economics, because there these questions of values obviously pop up. But it's also a question that we have in our society more general, because it always plays a role when it comes to the evaluation of certain claims. Here in science, it's actually a little bit easier because we have certain standards to which we usually agree upon when evaluating these claims, but it's a question more generally. I think what I would say is that these values, that every economic analysis is somehow based on values. And these values enter when we evaluate the outcomes of the models, the way we frame the outcomes of these models as being optimal or suboptimal. They come by the welfare criterion we use to evaluate the outcome of the models. If we say, like, the classic utilitaristic way of maximizing the overall utility of all agents involved, or whether we say, okay, no, we are more interested in the wealth of the least benefited parts of the population, etc., etc. So values are an inherent part of this. And then there are some people who say, yes, that's true, but there's also a part of economics that is not affected by these kind of values, namely the say, purely descriptive parts of models, where models simply show that there's a certain trade-off between choices, for example, how much to invest in green technologies. Then these models make some predictions of what the implications are, but they don't say, okay, this is better than the other. So that is something we leave to policymakers. Therefore, these models are, say, less value-driven than the others. And in some sense, I would say, yes, in some sense, that is true. At least they do not make these explicit claims, but they are still value-driven. First of all, because how they frame the problem they put at center stage, and the problems they leave out. The measures they suggest. So, for example, do they suggest to use GDP as a measure of well-being? Therefore, I also make implicit value judgments about the relative importance of care work, because that's not included in the GDP. Also, the choice: who are the agents that I consider in my model? Are the agents, say, or people of a given country, or of the world or whatever? Are the agents, are they households or are they individuals? I mean, even this comes with a certain value judgment because it values the relevance of the question of how wealth is distributed within the household. So there are a lot of values that automatically enter every economic analysis simply by choosing to put this question at center stage and to put this kind of trade-off at center stage. It's nothing that is bad per se. It is absolutely necessary. But it's also important to acknowledge, I would say, from a scientific point of view, that these value judgments are always there. And you could derive from this also an argument about the necessary levels of plurality in economics, namely that you say, okay, if we as economists are serious that we do not want to impose our value structure on the societies we're studying, then we need to allow a certain diversity of value judgments and therefore also a diversity of different models, different approaches to study these systems we are studying, and also a variety of problems covered. This is a very intricate area where we also talk about the diversity of the researchers who do the research and the questions they put at center stage. For example, in economics, we know that the diversity of economists is rather low. Most of them come from rather rich backgrounds. They are majority, they are male, they are white. I mean, there's nothing bad about like male white people, I would say, but of course, they tend to see much problems more straightforwardly because of the experience they usually made in their lives than somebody else. Like, for example, a black person coming from a developing country, or a black person coming from the state probably sees other problems as immediately relevant simply because of their biography as a white person. When they talk to each other, they both can integrate the perspective of the other people, and both of them can do the same great research. But I'm just saying that this kind of diversity of values, this diversity of people, the diversity of experiences has some impact on the kind of studies that we do. And if we make this explicit, I think we could see more of the biases economists currently has, despite the claim of many people that it can be a value-free science. And I'm saying it can't. It should be implicit about these biases, because then something can be done about them. And the things that can be done about them usually have to do with pluralist economics.
It's really interesting that you talk about values are inherent to economics and kind of to any science, and you can't go without them. It makes me think that like, look at historical debates about economics, Keynesians versus Austrians, and in some ways it's not necessarily that their approaches were different, though they were, but it's also that the value judgments that they brought to bear, right? Like some things you say there, like there are so many different approaches, and in a way they have different values. And like I've been thinking a lot about anthropological economics and these kinds of things. And as you say, like, actually, what do we value? Do we want the most consumption and the most production? Sometimes I like thinking about these issues, and sometimes I'm like, I don't know. And then I like the traditional mainstream economic views. So given that even the values which we bring to bear on economics that we sometimes think we can strip away in science, but we really can't. Given that, what are the challenges in pluralistic economics in trying to bring together all these different views?
I mean, on the one hand, I would clarify that. And I think that becomes also clear from our conversation. That's a huge topic, and it is absolutely impossible that one single person can be an expert in all these things, and that one different person can take the perspective of everyone in this world. That is, I think, why science definitely is a social project, and where there need to be a division of labor. And that's why I think that these scientific institutions are so important, because they allow for conversations where we each help each other to get rid of our blind spots and to see different perspectives. And I think they should value this kind of exchange. So that's just as a disclaimer in the very beginning. And I think even the person who says pluralism in economics is the most important thing for me, and I try to work as pluralist as possible. I mean, even this person would never be able to integrate all perspective at once, because then this person would not be able to do anything. So it's really about the interaction and the constructive engagement with each other. And I'm not sure whether I 100% understood your question, but if I understood correctly, it's about the challenges that come with this diversity of different approaches, that diversity of the different perspectives. And I think this is something, in my view, is often underrated in this debate about pluralism. Many people advocating for a greater plurality, some sort in economics, they are often keen to point out the benefits that we have from this, like to address these kind of blind spots, to see the implications of the lack of diversity in economics, the problems that come up with a focus on a single way of doing and teaching economics. And I think they are right about this. There are epistemological, ethical, welfare costs associated with this lack of plurality, and increasing the plurality in many dimensions, not in all, but in several dimensions, would come with epistemological, ethical benefits. But, of course, a greater plurality also comes with costs. So, I mean, if you have a group of people who are meant to study the main determinants and implications of economic growth in the UK, and all of them are trained in the same method, and they are trained in the same way of doing economics, I'm pretty sure they are rather quick in coming up with something workable. However, if you have the same amount of people coming from very different backgrounds, coming from very different ways of doing economics, coming from very different value bases, they will need much greater amount of time in talking to each other, in deciding what is the best way of approaching this problem. And maybe they are even unsuccessful in the end to agree on what are the adequate guiding principles for approaching this question. So greater plurality comes with potential benefits, especially avoiding blind spots, and especially avoiding intellectual lock-ins, and especially shallowing our value judgments. But it also comes with costs. And in a paper that I've written together with Birte Strunk, we said there are basically two main sources for these challenges, for these problems. On the one hand, the so-called challenge of communication that says that the more diversified your group of people is in terms of theoretical, or in terms of approaches, the more difficult it is to delineate a common language. Also, interdisciplinarity is a great example. The more disciplines you try to make talking to each other, the more difficult it is to agree on the same language. The Marxist and the liberal can take some time to agree on a proper definition of capitalism, so to speak. And that's a problem you don't have if you agreed on the one way of doing science. And the second challenge is the challenge of quality control. So if you have somebody who's very much in anthropological research, qualitative research, etc., this person will judge the same study probably very different than somebody who's trained in quantitative analysis, econometrics, and so on. So they need to also debate about what's the right quality criterion of judging something, judging scientific work. So there are pros and cons of more and less plurality, and the question is, what is the right degree? Probably full maximizing plurality is very likely to be a bad idea. It's not workable. At the same time, I would say minimizing it by making science maximally efficient in a certain kind of way is also not a good idea. I think the current scientific and societal rules somehow bias us a little bit into this latter direction, because of the way scientific work is evaluated using rankings, using quantitative criteria, that usually gives a benefit to people who follow a very narrow approach but be very efficient about it. And this investments that we make to delineate a common language between different disciplines, between different people, between different approaches, there are no like academic success measures that actually give adequate credit to that. So there's not enough being done about it. But this is only to some extent the problem of the people who are not interested. I think it's more a problem of the scientific institutions and the way we evaluate science. So to sum up my answer to your question, plurality in every dimension always comes with potential benefits and costs. And the costs are associated with the challenge of communication and quality control. And we need to come up with some smart institutions that facilitate how we address these challenges if we want to make plurality something successful.
Thank you. And on a related topic I kind of wanted to get into, and you touched on there, is I'm interested in diving into the institutions. Like you mentioned, scientists are people writing papers and they have their careers to think about, and what uh, gets credited and what doesn't. So could we speak a bit about this meta science perspective of how economists are doing science, and what are some of the ways in the incentives are right, and what are some of the ways in which the incentives can go wrong?
Yeah, so incentives in the scientific system. I think this is something interesting because on the one hand, it applies to many sciences in general, but I think in many instances, it applies to economics in particular. So I would say one of the main incentive for people working in academia is, especially for young people, it's to get a job. So like to get an institutional position that ensures that they can continue to do their research and teaching activities. And if you, as a young person, think about, okay, what are the main determinants for me getting a job in economics, so to speak, then you could see, okay, what are the criteria committees use to distribute professorship positions? Because that's what it's about in the end. And then you see, okay, I do need to publish great papers. And great papers means to publish papers in journals that are ranked or that are high in the conventional rankings. In economics, it's best to publish in the so-called top 5, like American Economic Review, Econometrica, these kind of journals. So to have many publications there would be good. Then, of course, also more and more important becomes the attraction of third-party funding. So I should also do economics in a way that some people give me money to do my research. And if you look at the ways, okay, how are these research project proposals evaluated, then again, also these top publications are very important, and some other aspects as well. But top publications are really the most important thing. So if you say, okay, I have this goal of becoming a professor, so I really should invest a lot of time in writing papers that are likely to get accepted in the top journals. That also means I could probably improve the probability in going to a particular research institution that has been renowned for producing many PhD students who actually have the abilities to publish in these top journals. That means I need to choose research questions that are usually considered in these journals. I need to choose methods that are accepted in these journals, and I need to then narrow this down also to questions for which data is available, such that I can use those fancy statistical tools that are so highly acknowledged in this community, such that my work is considered to be adequate for these kind of top journals. So there are a lot of choices about the kind of question, the kind of method, also the kind of general approach that are affected simply by the way these rankings in economics are, or these rankings in academia more broadly are constructed. And so we talk about this kind of reactivity, right? The kind of success criteria we use to evaluate scholars have an effect on the behavior of these scholars. So they might adjust strategically their behavior to score high in these quality criteria. And I think this is one of the main reasons for why we have a more and more narrowing down of approaches in economics also, because people are somehow incentivized to focus on those particular strategies that maximize their success in academia. Now, you could also say that's actually a great thing, because this helps us to really to actually have a population of different approaches, and then selecting them according to the quality criteria, because the quality criteria are objective and good for science and good for society. But I would say there are a lot of unanticipated effects of these kind of rankings and the ways we evaluate research, namely that many questions are not considered, cannot be considered, because there is no data available to use fancy statistical techniques, etc., etc. So the choice of quality criteria immediately has after some time lag an effect on the questions, tools, etc. that are used in a scientific population. And I think we would need to be more self-reflective about that, especially in economics, because many biases within the discipline, also in terms of race, class, gender, etc., stem from the kind of quality criteria we use. And the difficulty in this discussion is, I personally think that those people, or the groups of people who decided on the relevance of these criteria, they didn't choose these criteria because they wanted to exclude particular people and particular questions from economic research. That wasn't like a conspiracy against studying poverty using qualitative tools. But it's a lot about the unanticipated effects. And then right now, it's also, of course, a debate about power relations and the stabilization of power and hierarchy, because many people now benefit from these criteria, and might not give up on them. Also because they might, from their own perspective, think if we give up on them, we would lose any kind of control about quality. So it's a discussion that also takes time to make clear your position to others. And make clear why you are skeptical about these kind of quality criteria and what your alternative suggestion is. But this is a debate that is relevant to science more broadly, I would say.
What are some alternative approaches, and relatedly, it's probably a more difficult question, is what is the actual prospect of changing these kinds of things? Because not you say there's many things can go well with these approaches, but also there are unintended consequences, and there's also kind of inertia. We've done things for so long, and especially with experimenting with the scientific method, right? You don't want to, people maybe rightly would be averse to changing things because we think we kind of have these procedures, and we must have them to be rigorous, and we have experience with the ones we do, but nevertheless, how might they be changed?
So, for example, if I just want to chip in, one argument I understand when it comes to Germany. So in Germany, we have when you decide who gets a professorship, you have these kind of committees. So there are basically usually 3 to 5 professors and a lot of other people who then collectively decide who should get the vacancy of the professorship. And I don't know, 50, 60 years ago, when this quantification of science, this strong relevance of rankings, etc., wasn't that prevalent. Many of these decisions were based on, more or less exclusively based on social ties. There are these famous old boys networks that collectively decided to give professorships to those people who they considered to be favorable to their own position or to their own PhD students, etc., etc. So there was a lot of corruption going on there. And I think that's a bad way of distributing academic positions and also academic prestige. There was also a lot of explicit intermingling between political views and the distribution of scientific jobs. And many people who today defend very strictly these strong quantitative evaluative criteria for science, like, for example, journal rankings in economics, they often made their experience in the older system, and they point out that, hey, I understand that rankings are not perfect, but they helped us to overcome this corrupt old boy problematic network. And I'm not willing to give that up because the cost of going back is too high, and therefore I want to stick to these illegally objective ranking qualitative quality criteria. And in some sense, that is understandable. And I think this argument should make us suspicious to suggestions that say, okay, hey, just get rid of all these quantitative criteria and just let a commission decide. Because then other biases will probably come up. But I mean, just because it was bad before doesn't mean that the current state is optimal and should not be changed. So I think it's also now time to call into question the strong focus on rankings, which implicitly often reproduces the biases from before, just in a legally objective way. But of course, when thinking about alternatives, we need to think about institutional strategies to avoid the relevance of old boys networks before. So if you engage in this discussion, you always need to be very empathic about why people hold the claims or the views people hold about how to evaluate science, and to take into adequate considerations the reservations people might have with good reasons, because it's not in Germany, it's not a good way to go back to the situation in the 60s or 70s. Still, I would say that's not a sufficient argument to stick to the current practices.
You have a paper on switching topics a bit on degrowth, and this might be an interesting way to think about pluralist economics and like how it might help think about an important issue or important thing we're considering. I really like this paper thinking about degrowth and its impact not just on developed economies but also on the global south. So could you speak a bit about degrowth and these issues?
Yeah, so this is you're mentioning a paper that I've written together with Berta Strunk, who is doing her PhD at the New School in the US, and it was a really great process of writing this paper, because Berta is very much in this degrowth community and knows a lot about it. I'm personally a little bit agnostic with regard to degrowth. I'm not have made up my mind about it. So it was a really cool collaboration. And in the paper, what we did was we both are interested in the issue of global inequality and how the well-being of people in one place of the world is dependent or affected by the well-being of people in other parts of the world. So the question of how is well-being, especially in countries of the global south, related to the actions of people living in the global north. And this is a question that when you go to the degrowth camp, many people say, okay, there are a lot of bad things happening in the global south because of actions taken up in the global north. So, for example, many of the consumption patterns in the global north require production activities that are associated with great environmental damages, and these production activities are usually located in the global south, and thereby our mode of living in the north externalizes a lot of social and economic costs, ecological costs, to people living in the global south. And then the degrowth program as a whole, I must say I'm not an expert on degrowth, so I'm coming from this community, but the general claim of degrowth as a whole is that a fundamental problem with our mode of living and doing economics especially in the global north has to do with our reliance on economic growth as an imperative. And they usually claim that our reliance on economic growth is one of the main sources for the social and ecological costs that emerge and that are mainly burdened upon people living in the global south. And then within the degrowth discourse, there are many different proposals of how we can change it. Many of them call into question whether capitalism in its more or less current form is even the right way to organize economic provisioning. But that's very diverse. What we did in this paper is we wanted to see what people in the degrowth movement say about degrowth and the global south. So to what extent do people say we need degrowth in the north and in the south, or do people say we need degrowth only in the north and people in the economies in the global south should be allowed to grow, etc., etc. So what we did is we did a huge literature review on the academic degrowth discourse. So we focus on academic contributions, leaving aside many of the non-academic outlets, which are also relevant in the degrowth movement as a whole, but we focus on the academic outlet. And we looked at what do people write about degrowth and the global south. And we came up with a couple of, I would say, interesting conclusions. First of all, we found that it's mainly people from the global north writing about these issues. So large share of the authors writing about degrowth and the global south actually are affiliated with institutions from the global north, which is a little bit weird in some sense, but also not surprising given how resources and etc. are distributed in the scientific system. And we also found that there are a couple of common arguments that are made in this in this debate. People usually stress that, or often stress that there is actually a synergy or complementarity between degrowth movements in the North and the South. Also, in an intellectual level, that many ideas of the degrowth discourse, so the term degrowth comes from Europe, but it was inspired by a lot of thinking from thinkers in the global South, marginalized groups, that many people consider degrowth in the North to be important to get rid of post-colonial structures, so degrowth as a mean to decolonize the relationship between the global North and the global South, etc. But there are also some challenges mentioned, although only about a third of the papers we finally found out focus more on this challenge side. This is about the problem that degrowth might be also a little bit neo-colonial agenda setting, that these rich guys in the global North tell people in the global South to not grow so much. Although that is also something that's criticized quite widely within the degrowth community, but it's an argument that's being made. But what we found to be particularly interesting is, because that is a main question that I have, is that what actually happens to the economies in the global South if we do some degrowth policies in the global North? So degrowth is often associated with a reduction of consumption and production patterns. And if you say, okay, that is something that we need to do in the global North, and we probably need to do it because for reasons of ecological sustainability. What does it mean for people in the global South? An immediate example is that this would reduce the demand for especially raw materials or certain activities that are currently focused in the global South, and where people in the global South are able to pursue these activities because they are exporting the resulting services and goods to people in the global North. And this might be associated with particular ecological damages, and I'm not denying that, but also, there's a flip side in the sense that reducing this demand for the goods from the global South can come with considerable problems for the people in the global South, at least in the short time before there have been some adjustments. And we call this the twin problem of global dependencies. That on the one hand, this exploitation of many people in the global South by economic actors from the global North is for many people a justification for why degrowth is actually necessary, because you want to get rid of these exploitation patterns. But at the same time, it's also a challenge to degrowth because of the dependencies in the world economy, the well-intentioned policies of the global North could have, at least in the short time, have detrimental effects of the people in the global South. And we found that this is a problem that has not received a lot of attention in the degrowth discourse so far. It has been mentioned by a couple of people, but it hasn't been put at the focus of the analysis. And interestingly, we believe, many might disagree, but we believe this also has to do with the prevalent tools and methods that are currently employed in the degrowth community, because it works very differently than economic mainstream, because especially quantitative models are not that widespread. They are used more and more, but they are still making up only a small share of the papers that we studied. And we think that these quantitative models might be particularly well suited to quantify and to better understand and anticipate the negative effects that people in the global South might suffer as a consequence of degrowth policies in the North. And such analysis, we think, is not necessarily an argument against degrowth per se, but it might be helpful to come up with some guideline policies or other changes we need in the institutional system of the world economy that are necessary to impose alongside with degrowth policies in the North if we really cared for the well-being of people in the global South. So in some sense, we found a lack of plurality in the degrowth discourse with particular questions and methods. And we think that addressing this lack of plurality could help us to shed light on this question of how, in the long term, actually we can avoid these these negative implications for people in the global South as a consequence of degrowth in the global North. So that's what the paper is about.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you might say that you would do it because you have the global North and South have these interdependencies, and maybe growth here in the North kind of can exploit the South, and that's bad for them. But then the reducing growth could also simultaneously be bad for them, and so it's yeah. I mean, I really I appreciate that kind of nuanced debate that you sort of trying to sort of broach there. But also one thing I often think about is as countries get richer, they care more about the environment, and you can say that colonialism happened and things, but at the end of the day, what one approach could be to kind of keep helping everyone get richer, and sometimes it can also be getting richer is hard though. It's one of the most complex problems, and so you can be like, well, let's just not care about growth, and that sometimes I think that might be a way of warping our values in a way that doesn't help. But at the so uh, one other thing too is
It's easy for us, like you and me, to say we don't need more growth or we need to get rid of it because our environment and our lives look very different to people in other parts of the world. And often people who make these claims, I have the personal feeling, I'm probably sure that many also of my co-authors wouldn't agree, but I would say that many people underestimate the degree of economic degradation in this world when they say, okay, we need to be very critical, skeptical about the avenues of growth.
And interesting, you also have some work on sustainability, and EU's sort of green policies, and even I'll be interested, as a final topic to hear about that. But sustainability itself is hard to define, right? And what do we mean by being able to if we define it as persisting and being able to not harm future generations? Are there harms of omission of the technological advancements we didn't make? And also, if things are constantly changing anyway, then how could we ever have something that persists forever? I mean, sometimes I think that wanting to have sustainability in the sense of nothing changes. Well, I don't know if we want nothing to change. So could you speak about what we mean by sustainability and what the EU's done and how that sort of relates to the rest of the world?
I mean, that's always these difficult questions about what does X mean, what does capitalism mean, what does sustainability mean. Try to make some comments about what kind of work I do on that. In some sense, it's a little bit similar than the degrowth paper. So what I'm currently interested in is, so in the EU we have a certain idea of sustainability that has to do with ability to reproduce economies in an adequate way, so to ensure good living standards for all, but also to remain within ecological limits and take them seriously. But in the policy sphere, the term sustainability remains to be debated and subject to discursive struggles. So if we really want to define it, I think it's probably hard to find a definition in the policy sphere that is not that general that it's not helpful anymore. For the research, we can obviously agree on certain definitions of the ability to persist in a social and ecological sustainable way, in the sense that the system doesn't break down and respects the tipping points and boundaries. What I'm more interested in is actually with the policy proposals in the EU that were created as a consequence of taking more serious ecological limits. So the von der Leyen Commission, they came up with this idea of the Green Deal, of the development model of sustainable, competitive sustainability, and so on, and that came with the idea that we need to implement some policy changes at the EU level. And I'm interested in the implications of these policy changes to different people in the EU. So I did some work on unequal development in the EU, and we identified different development models in the EU. That means strategies of countries to develop in some sense. You find then different country groups following different development models, like core countries like Austria, Germany, Belgium, Scandinavian countries. that build their development models very much on technological complexity, technological capabilities, the ability to construct or provide services, goods and services that require a lot of technological knowledge and to be competitive on world markets. And another group that is particularly relevant in the EU are mostly Eastern European countries, because they entered the EU with very low levels of living standards, very low incomes of the people. They have been catching up to the countries in the core of Europe in the previous decades. They mainly have done so because they now host some economic activities that were previously hosted in Southern Europe. So the success of Eastern Europe is in some sense also related to the problems in Southern Europe. And it seems to be the case, at least the current state of our incomplete research suggests, that this also has to do with the comparative advantages of these Eastern European countries, especially lower wages and also the willingness to accept certain kind of ecological damages, and also the use of cheap inputs such as, for example, electricity produced by coal. And then the question obviously is, what does this new green focus, the Green Deal, the idea of competitive sustainability, what does that mean for the Eastern European economies? To what extent are the challenges associated with these green transformation more severe for these economies in the East as compared to, for example, the economies in Central Europe? And maybe are the opportunities of these new development strategy focused more on people living in Central Europe as compared to Eastern Europe? And as with the degrowth thing, I'm not posing these questions to say we should get rid of these green transformation. To the contrary, I think it's absolutely necessary. But I think if we want to get these policies accepted, we also need to understand the negative implications and how they are distributed and to what they are distributed in an unfair fashion. And if they are, we should do something about it. The EU says that it is willing to do something about it. So there is a lot of talk about the fair transition, green transition. But my feeling is that we understood too poorly how these challenges are actually distributed. And the party in Poland, for example, the piece that has lost the last elections, but that has been very influential also in the EU, has often put this narrative at center stage. We do something for the poor people in Poland, and those are the people that are affected negatively by this green transition, and we are the ones protecting them from this green transition. And this is a very powerful narrative. And I think the best answer to this narrative is not to say, hey guys, in the end we are all on average winning by the green transition. No, I think the best answer would be to accept that certain people are losing, to see what these negative effects are, to take it seriously, to also listen to these people, and then to think of what we can do to mitigate these negative effects. That's why in our research we also try to talk to these people on the ground. So we have these kind of macroeconomic input-output analysis, but we also have interviews with people living in regions that are very much dependent on these ecologically harmful activities like coal mining regions, etc., etc. And maybe it comes out that all these negative effects are not as big as one would have might anticipated, but I'm pretty sure that these negative effects are there. At least many people perceive them to be there, and I think we can do a better job in mitigating these effects, because it's not a question of whether we do the green transition or not. We do need to do it, but we do need to do it by taking seriously also the people that are concerned about the socioeconomic implications. I'm not sure whether this is helpful to come up with a proper definition of sustainability, but at least that's I'm doing in this context.
It's a really insightful answer. Yeah, it's insightful. That if I get it right, that you know, Eastern Europe kind of, in fact, in some ways they're growing quite fast at the moment in some countries, but that's based on like low like, you know, costs, and that's partly like the kind of the dirty energy, so to speak, that they have, right? So they could directly sort of hinder their costs. I really appreciate the like doing interviews with people as well. Like I mean personally for me as well, you kind of learn a lot from like kind of a feel of like you know what are people thinking about. And I think more generally it's an interesting point that academics like can be kind of abstracted too far away from the experience of people, and you can kind of fiddle with models so much that it's kind of, you know, actually hard to appreciate what other people, you know, kind of their experience about what say economic policies are actually doing on the ground. Um,
Yeah, I think as
yeah.
always, it has pros and cons, right? I mean, I don't think we should do interviews all the time, but sometimes they point out, especially informal institutions, that lead to the effects of certain policies that you just cannot see simply by looking at the official data, because these informalities are not visible in the data because they are not adequately corrected. So their interviews can be very interesting and insightful. Of course, you always also need to take into account that maybe the person you're talking to has a certain agenda. So it can't like take over your task of answering particular questions, but it can be one useful brick in the overall puzzle that of solving these particular challenges. Again, the right degree of plurality, I would say.
Well, I don't have any more questions, so thank you, Claudius. Any last words you want to say, and what are you going to be doing in the future, and where can people find your work?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I mean, there are a lot of things. Made a couple of notes notes down here about what I want to say, and I said about
Hmm.
I probably said far too much, but still only 50% about it. And
Right.
so I hope it wasn't too boring for the people
That was great.
listening. I mean, I can also, I don't know, post some of the references for the stuff that I've said. So I think maybe the final words. This topic of pluralism is intricate. It's related to many also societal debates that we're currently facing. Many of the strategies to make pluralism work in science refer to actually theories about how to make democracy work. So I think pluralism is a topic that's intricate, but it's actually really interesting to look at. Even for people not working in economics, I think it's something that really makes us inspires us to think in ways that are relevant in our daily practices. So hopefully I didn't destroy the interests of the people on that. What I'm about to do in the future, I mean, I will continue with this or delve more into this question of unequal or heterogeneous impacts of the green transition in Europe. That's one thing. The second thing I would definitely want to work more on is this issue of global development and the implications of our living standards in the global north on people in the global south, and to understand better how different theories of development can help us to understand the determinants or the reasons for why countries are in the state they are. What is the relative role of national institutions versus international or global dependencies? I think this is something where pluralism really has something to offer against the often focus purely on structures and systems on the one side, and national institutions and individual choices on the other hand. I think pluralism can highlight the middle, and this is something I want to do. Maybe also related with this topic of degrowth. I mean, degrowth is a big topic. It's related with the question to how we want to live. And as I said, I don't have a definite opinion on it because I have the feeling I haven't understood it enough. And I would be very happy to understand it a little bit better, how economic activities relate to all the other cultural mechanisms operating in our societies. So I'd be happy if I understood that a little bit better in 5 to 10 years. But let's see. I mean, in science, you never know. Maybe in 2 years, I figure out that my approach wasn't that good at all, and then I hope I have the courage to say, okay, that was also not so great. I need to do something different.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Claudius.
Cool. Yeah, Jack,
Appreciate it.
thank you very much for having me. Great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.